Imagine standing on the streets of one of America's fastest growing cities. The year is 1871. Around you, wooden buildings stretch toward the sky, their facades painted to look like marble and stone. Horse-drawn carriages clatter down dusty streets lined with boardwalks. The air smells of sawdust, coal smoke, and the unmistakable scent of the stockyards to the south. This is Chicago, a city of 300,000 souls, a metropolis that has grown from a muddy trading post to the commercial heart of America in just 4 decades. It's a city built on ambition, on the dreams of thousands of immigrants, on the rushing energy of a young nation pushing westward. But tonight, October 8th, 1871, everything is about to change. In the next 36 hours, a fire will consume nearly 4 square miles of this wooden wonderland. It will leave 100,000 people homeless, 1/3 of the entire population. It will kill approximately 300 people and destroy 17,500 buildings. The financial losses will reach $200 million. That's roughly $5 billion in today's money. And yet, from those ashes, something remarkable will emerge, a city reborn. A city that will pioneer fireproof construction, revolutionize urban architecture, and give birth to the modern skyscraper. The Great Chicago Fire didn't destroy Chicago. In many ways, it created it. This is the story of that fire and the city that refused to die. To understand why the Great Chicago Fire became such a catastrophe, we first need to understand what Chicago was in 1871 and why it was practically designed to burn. Chicago's growth had been nothing short of miraculous. In 1833, the settlement consisted of about 350 people living near the mouth of the Chicago River. By 1871, it had exploded to 300,000 residents, making it the 5th largest city in America. This wasn't gradual growth. It was an explosion driven by the railroad, the grain trade, and the lumber industry. And here's where the problem began. Chicago was built almost entirely of wood. The city sat at the crossroads of America's great lumber trade. Vast forests of white pine from Michigan and Wisconsin were floated down Lake Michigan and processed in Chicago's sawmills before being shipped westward to build the expanding frontier. Wood was cheap, plentiful, and fast to build with. And when you're growing as fast as Chicago was growing, speed matters. So Chicagoans built with wood. Not just houses, everything. Wooden sidewalks ran for miles through the city. Wooden bridges spanned the river. Wooden grain elevators towered along the waterfront. Even the streets themselves were often made of wood, with pine blocks laid like bricks to keep carriages from sinking into the mud. The wealthy merchants on Michigan Avenue lived in wooden mansions painted to look like brownstone. The workers in the immigrant neighborhoods of the West Side lived in wooden tenements and cottages packed together like matchsticks. The stockyards to the south were surrounded by wooden fences, wooden barns, and mountains of wooden railroad ties. Fire insurance companies called Chicago the worst fire risk in America. They weren't wrong. The wooden construction was only part of the problem. The summer and fall of 1871 had been exceptionally dry. Between July and October, Chicago received only 2.5 inches of rain, about a quarter of the normal amount. The wooden buildings, the wooden sidewalks, the wooden everything, all of it had baked in the summer sun until it was dry as kindling. And fires were already a regular occurrence. In the week before October 8th alone, the Chicago Fire Department responded to more than 20 fires. The night before the Great Fire, they had battled a significant blaze in the lumber district that had burned for 16 hours and left the firefighters exhausted. The department itself was dangerously understaffed. Chicago had only 185 firefighters to protect 300,000 people, about 1 firefighter for every 1,600 residents. They had 17 horse-drawn steam engines, 4 hose carts, and 2 hook and ladder companies. For a city the size of Chicago, it was barely adequate under normal conditions. Under the conditions of October 1871, it would prove catastrophically insufficient. The city was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. The fire began, as best anyone can tell, around 8:30 on the evening of Sunday, October 8th, 1871. The location was 137 DeKoven Street on the city's west side, a working-class neighborhood populated largely by Irish and German immigrants. The property belonged to Patrick and Catherine O'Leary. Patrick was a laborer. Catherine supplemented the family income by selling milk from the 5 cows they kept in a small barn behind their cottage. On that Sunday evening, Catherine had gone to bed early, exhausted. Patrick was already asleep. Their neighbors, the McLaughlins, were hosting a small party in the cottage next door. And then somehow, the barn caught fire. You've probably heard the story. Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicked over a lantern while being milked, starting the fire that destroyed Chicago. It's one of the most famous origin stories in American history. It's also almost certainly false. Catherine O'Leary testified under oath that she had not been in the barn that evening, that she had been in bed since about 8 o'clock. Multiple witnesses supported her account. The cow kicked the lantern story appears to have been invented by a reporter named Michael Heron, who later admitted he made it up because he thought it would make a good story. So what really started the fire? We don't know for certain. Various theories have been proposed over the years. Some historians believe the fire was started by Daniel Peg Leg Sullivan, a neighbor who was the first to spot the flames and who may have been in the barn at the time. Others have suggested the McLaughlin party got out of hand, or that boys from the neighborhood were gambling in the barn and accidentally started the blaze. In 1997, the Chicago City Council officially exonerated Mrs. O'Leary and her cow. 125 years too late to do her any good, but better late than never. In 2004, a new theory emerged suggesting the fire might have been caused by meteor fragments from Biela's comet, which was breaking apart that year and passed near Earth in October. The theory points to several other major fires that broke out across the Midwest on the same night, including the Peshtigo fire in Wisconsin, which actually killed far more people than the Chicago fire. However, most historians remain skeptical of the comet theory. The truth is, the specific cause of the Great Chicago Fire matters less than the conditions that allowed it to spread. Chicago was ready to burn. If it hadn't been the O'Leary barn that night, it would have been something else, somewhere else, sooner or later. The city had created the perfect conditions for catastrophe. What matters now is what happened next. Daniel Sullivan spotted the flames in the O'Leary barn around 8:45 p.m. He ran to the house and woke the O'Learys, then tried to free the animals from the burning barn. He managed to save a calf before the heat drove him back. The fire was already beyond control. But the disaster was compounded by a critical error at the city's fire alarm office. A watchman named Matthias Schaffer spotted the glow of the fire from his position in the courthouse tower. He sent a signal to alert the fire department, but he sent them to the wrong location, a box about a mile from the actual fire. By the time the firefighters realized their mistake and redirected to the correct location, precious minutes had been lost. Then things got worse. A citizen ran to the closest fire alarm box to call in the fire. The signal never went through. The box was later found to be malfunctioning. Another delay. More precious time lost. When the first fire engines finally arrived at DeKoven Street, the fire had already spread from the O'Leary barn to the neighboring buildings. A strong southwest wind was pushing the flames northeast, toward the heart of the city. Embers were flying through the air, landing on rooftops blocks away, and starting new fires. The firefighters tried to establish a fire break, but the flames kept jumping ahead of them. The heat was so intense that wooden buildings were igniting before the fire even reached them, a phenomenon called convective heating. The fire created its own weather system, a massive column of superheated air that rose thousands of feet into the sky and pulled in fresh oxygen from all directions, feeding the flames and creating hurricane-force winds. By 11:30 p.m., the fire had crossed the South Branch of the Chicago River. This was supposed to be impossible. Rivers were supposed to stop fires. But the river was choked with lumber, coal barges, and wooden ships. The bridges were made of wood. Lumberyards lined both banks. The fire simply walked across the water on a carpet of fuel. Once across the river, the fire entered Chicago's business district, the Burnt District, as it would soon be called. Here were the grand hotels, the banks, the theaters, the newspaper offices, the city's finest stores. All of them built with wooden frames behind their stone and brick facades. All of them kindling. The Tremont House, one of Chicago's finest hotels, was evacuated and burned. The Palmer House, which had opened just 13 days earlier as the city's most luxurious hotel, burned to the ground. The Tribune Building, home to the city's leading newspaper, went up in flames, though not before the editors managed to put out one last edition, its headline reading simply, "The Fire." The courthouse, with its great bell tower that served as the central fire alarm station, held out until about 2 a.m. on Monday. When it caught fire, the bell continued to ring as the tower burned, a death knell for the city, some said. The heat became so intense that the bell's mechanism fused and it fell silent. Then the tower collapsed. By dawn on Monday, October 9th, the entire central business district was in flames. The fire had jumped the main branch of the Chicago River and was now burning through the north side. the city's wealthiest residential neighborhood. Magnificent mansions, churches, and parks that had taken decades to build were consumed in minutes. While the firefighters waged their losing battle against the flames, the people of Chicago faced a more immediate problem: survival. The streets became rivers of humanity. Families piled their belongings onto wagons, wheelbarrows, anything with wheels. Those who couldn't afford wagons carried what they could on their backs. The wealthy and the poor fled side by side, all of them refugees now. Joseph Chamberlain, a reporter for the Chicago Evening Post, left us one of the most vivid accounts of that terrible night. The people were mad, he wrote. Despite the police making their best efforts, there was a good deal of robbery and violence. Valuable plate glass windows were broken into, and the contents carried off or destroyed. Saloons were entered, and the liquors drunk or wasted. Men turned into demons. Some fell insensible with drink and died unheeded, their bodies being roasted in the flames. Horace White, editor of the Tribune, described the scene from his office window before being forced to flee. The fire was moving northward like ocean surf on a sand beach. It had already traveled an eighth of a mile and was increasing forward with tremendous energy. Nothing could stop it. The wealthy dragged their possessions into the streets, only to abandon them as the fire approached faster than expected. One observer described seeing a piano standing alone on the sidewalk, playing the national anthem by itself. The heat had warped the strings and caused them to vibrate. People fled toward the lake, the one direction the fire couldn't follow. Lincoln Park, on the north side, became a massive refugee camp. Families huddled among the gravestones of the cemetery that occupied part of the park, watching their city burn. The sand along the lakefront was packed with people, many standing in the water to escape the tremendous heat. Some sought refuge in the stone buildings they believed would survive. Many didn't. The heat was so intense that even fireproof buildings burned. Their stone walls remained standing, but everything inside was consumed. The Chicago Historical Society had stored its collection, irreplaceable documents from the city's earliest days, in a building believed to be fireproof. The documents survived the fire itself but were destroyed by the water that firefighters poured into the building afterward. The waterworks on the north side, which supplied the city's fire hydrants, burned. With the pumping station destroyed, the firefighters lost water pressure. They were left with nothing but buckets and prayers. Throughout the night and into Monday, the exodus continued. An estimated 100,000 people, one-third of Chicago's population, were driven from their homes. They carried children, they carried pets, they carried family photographs and marriage certificates and the family Bible. They carried whatever fragment of their former lives they could hold in their hands. Behind them, the city they had built was disappearing into smoke and flame. By Monday evening, October 9th, it seemed like nothing could stop the fire. It had burned through the west side, consumed the business district, crossed both branches of the river, and was now devouring the north side. The fire front stretched for miles. Embers carried by the wind were starting spot fires as far as 2 miles ahead of the main blaze. The firefighters were exhausted, demoralized, and running out of options. Fire Marshal Robert Williams, who had been directing operations for more than 24 hours straight, was near collapse. The steam engines were breaking down. The horses were dying of exhaustion. And then, late on Monday night, salvation came in the form of rain. It started as drizzle around 11 p.m. By midnight, it had become a steady rain that continued through the night and into Tuesday morning. The rain was modest by normal standards, not a dramatic thunderstorm, just a persistent soaking rain. But it was enough. The fire had also begun to run out of fuel. It had burned nearly to the city limits on the north side. Beyond the developed areas, there was nothing left to burn but the open prairie. The combination of rain and lack of fuel finally brought the great fire to a halt. By Tuesday morning, October 10th, the fire was out. The destruction was almost beyond comprehension. The fire had burned an area roughly 4 miles long and an average of 3/4 of a mile wide, about 2,100 acres, or 3.3 square miles. Within that zone, virtually everything was destroyed. The official statistics would eventually record 17,450 buildings destroyed, 73 miles of streets burned, 120 miles of sidewalk consumed, 2,000 lampposts melted, every bridge over the main branch of the Chicago River gone. Approximately 300 people were known dead, though the true number was almost certainly higher. Many bodies were never recovered, consumed entirely by the flames. Conservative estimates suggest the actual death toll may have been between 500 and 1,000. 100,000 people, roughly 1 in 3 Chicagoans, were homeless. The total property damage was estimated at $200 million, about $5 billion in today's dollars. This represented roughly 1/3 of the entire property value of Chicago. Insurance companies would eventually pay out about $100 million, though many smaller insurers simply went bankrupt rather than honor their policies. As the smoke cleared on that Tuesday morning, the survivors looked out over a landscape that resembled nothing so much as a battlefield. Chimneys stood like gravestones amid miles of rubble. The stone and iron facades of buildings that had burned from within stood as hollow shells. The air was thick with ash and the smell of wet charcoal. Chicago, the wonder of the West, the city that had risen from a swamp to become a metropolis, lay in ruins. The response to the Great Chicago Fire was one of the largest humanitarian relief efforts in American history up to that point. Help came from across the country and around the world, demonstrating a spirit of solidarity that would become a defining characteristic of how America responds to disaster. Within hours of the fire's end, supplies began arriving. Cities across America organized relief drives. New York sent trainloads of food, blankets, and clothing. St. Louis sent firefighting equipment. Cincinnati sent 10,000 cooked hams. Even international aid arrived. Queen Victoria sent a personal message of condolence along with a contribution, and the City of London organized a relief fund. The Chicago Relief and Aid Society, a private charitable organization, took charge of coordinating the relief effort. Within a week, they had set up distribution centers across the city, providing food, clothing, and temporary shelter to the homeless. Army tents were brought in from military posts across the Midwest, creating vast tent cities in Lincoln Park, on the prairie west of the city, and along the lakefront. Mayor Roswell Mason placed the city under martial law, calling in state militia to maintain order. General Philip Sheridan, the Civil War hero who happened to be stationed in Chicago, took command of the military forces. His soldiers patrolled the ruins, preventing looting and protecting the distribution of relief supplies. But even as the relief effort addressed the immediate crisis, the city's leaders were already thinking about the future. Chicago's business community, many of whom had lost everything, met within days of the fire to begin planning reconstruction. Their message was clear: Chicago would rebuild, and it would rebuild bigger and better than before. The rebuilding of Chicago was one of the most remarkable urban transformations in history. In just 3 years, the city would not only recover from the fire, it would surpass its pre-fire size and prosperity. The ashes of the Great Fire became the foundation for what we now call modern urban architecture. The rebuilding began almost immediately. Within a week of the fire, the Tribune newspaper was publishing again from temporary quarters. Within a month, more than 6,000 temporary buildings had been erected. Within a year, the downtown business district had been largely rebuilt, with many buildings bigger and grander than their predecessors. But speed wasn't the only priority. The city was also determined to build safer. The fire had exposed the deadly weakness of wood construction, and Chicago's new building codes would mandate fireproof materials in the commercial district. Brick and stone became the standard. Wooden buildings were banned from the downtown area. More significantly, the fire created an opportunity for architectural innovation. Chicago had been growing so fast before the fire that there had been little time for careful planning or innovative design. Now, with a blank slate and an urgent need to rebuild, architects from across the country flocked to the city. What emerged was nothing less than a revolution in building design. Chicago became the birthplace of the modern skyscraper and the testing ground for a new approach to architecture that would eventually transform cities around the world. The pioneers of what came to be called the Chicago School of Architecture developed new techniques that made tall buildings possible. William LeBaron Jenney designed the Home Insurance Building, completed in 1885, which is generally considered the first true skyscraper. Its revolutionary innovation was a load-bearing iron frame. The building's walls didn't support the weight of the structure. The metal skeleton did. This meant buildings could go much taller than ever before. Louis Sullivan, who would become known as the father of modernism, developed a philosophy of architecture based on the famous principle that form follows function. His buildings rejected historical ornamentation in favor of designs that expressed the building's purpose and construction. Daniel Burnham and John Root designed buildings that pushed the limits of height and elegance. Their Monadnock building, completed in 1891, was for a time the largest office building in the world. Burnham would later create the famous 1909 plan of Chicago, the first comprehensive urban plan for an American city, would shape Chicago's development for generations. The young architect Frank Lloyd Wright got his start working in Chicago in the years after the fire, absorbing the Chicago School's innovations before developing his own revolutionary prairie style. The Great Fire didn't just destroy Chicago's old downtown, it cleared the way for a new kind of city, one defined by steel and stone, by towers that reach for the sky, by a bold new vision of what urban architecture could be. Behind the statistics and the architectural innovations were human stories, tales of loss, survival, and remarkable resilience. Catherine O'Leary, blamed by popular legend for starting the fire, never recovered from the notoriety. She spent the rest of her life avoiding the public eye, refusing to speak about the fire. She died in 1895, still bearing the weight of a blame she almost certainly didn't deserve. It wasn't until 1997 that the Chicago City Council officially exonerated her. Potter Palmer, one of the city's wealthiest merchants, lost his magnificent Palmer House Hotel just 2 weeks after its grand opening. The loss was estimated at $2 million. Palmer's response? He immediately announced plans to build a bigger, grander, absolutely fireproof Palmer House on the same site. The new hotel opened in 1875 and remained a Chicago landmark for generations. Cyrus McCormick, whose Reaper factory had helped transform American agriculture, watched his plant burn to the ground. He rebuilt it within a year and continued his business, eventually becoming one of the founders of what would become International Harvester. Marshall Field, who would build one of America's greatest department store empires, lost his downtown store in the fire. He rebuilt and expanded, eventually creating the Marshall Field and Company store that became a Chicago institution. But perhaps the most moving stories came from ordinary Chicagoans who simply refused to give up. One woman, whose name has been lost to history, walked into a relief station 3 days after the fire. She had lost her home, her husband, and 2 of her 3 children. She had walked for miles carrying her surviving child. When asked what she needed, she reportedly said, "A needle and thread, so I can start over." That spirit, the determination to rebuild, to start over, to move forward, came to define Chicago's identity. The city adopted a new motto after the fire: "I will." It was more than a slogan, it was a promise. The Great Chicago Fire left a legacy that extends far beyond the city's rebuilt skyline. It transformed how Americans think about urban planning, fire safety, and disaster response. Fire safety regulations were transformed nationwide. Cities across America looked at Chicago's devastation and asked themselves, could it happen here? Many adopted stricter building codes requiring fireproof construction in commercial districts. Fire department funding increased. New technologies for fighting fires were developed and deployed. The insurance industry was revolutionized. The Chicago Fire bankrupted 58 insurance companies and forced the industry to develop better methods for assessing and distributing risk. The modern system of reinsurance, where insurance companies spread their risk by insuring each other, emerged largely in response to the Chicago disaster. Urban planning became a profession. Before the Chicago Fire, cities largely grew without any overall plan or vision. Afterward, city leaders began to recognize the importance of comprehensive planning, of thinking about how a city should develop rather than just letting it happen. Chicago's 1909 Burnham Plan became a model for cities worldwide. Emergency response was transformed. The chaos of the fire's early hours, the misdirected firefighters, the malfunctioning alarm boxes, the lack of coordination led to reforms in how cities communicated during emergencies. Better alarm systems, clearer command structures, and regional mutual aid agreements all emerged from the lessons of the fire. In 1920, nearly 50 years after the Great Fire, the anniversary of the disaster was designated as Fire Prevention Day and eventually became Fire Prevention Week, still observed every October in the United States and Canada. Perhaps the most important legacy of the Great Chicago Fire was the demonstration that catastrophe could become opportunity. The fire destroyed a city, but from those ashes rose something greater. Chicago didn't just rebuild, it reinvented itself. Within 20 years of the fire, Chicago would host the World's Columbian Exposition of 1893, one of the most spectacular World's Fairs ever held. 27 million visitors came to see the White City, a dazzling complex of neoclassical buildings that announced Chicago's arrival as a world-class metropolis. The city that had been dismissed as an overgrown frontier town, a city of mud and stockyards and wooden shanties, had transformed itself into a showcase of urban civilization. The Great Fire hadn't destroyed Chicago's ambitions, it had set them free. Before we conclude, we need to talk about the fire you've probably never heard of. A fire that killed 6 times as many people as the Great Chicago Fire, but has been largely forgotten by history. On the same night that Chicago burned, October 8th, 1871, a massive fire swept through the forests and lumber towns of northeastern Wisconsin. The Peshtigo Fire, named for the town at its center, burned approximately 1.2 million acres and killed between 1,500 and 2,500 people, making it the deadliest fire in American history. The Peshtigo Fire was a true firestorm, generating its own weather patterns and winds of hurricane force. Survivors described a tornado of fire that lifted houses from their foundations and hurled railroad cars through the air. The heat was so intense that many victims were found with no visible injuries. They had suffocated or been killed by the thermal radiation before the flames ever reached them. Entire towns were erased. Families fled into rivers and creeks, only to be boiled alive as the water temperature rose. Those who survived often did so by complete chance, hiding in wells, finding refuge in wet areas, or simply being lucky enough to be in the fire's path when it momentarily weakened. So, why do we remember the Chicago Fire and forget the Peshtigo Fire? Several reasons. Chicago was a major city with national newspapers that covered the disaster extensively. Peshtigo was a remote lumber town. Many of the victims were recent immigrants whose deaths went unrecorded. The Chicago Fire destroyed the homes and businesses of wealthy, prominent citizens whose stories were told and retold. The Peshtigo Fire killed anonymous workers and farmers whose names were never known. The Peshtigo Fire deserves to be remembered not just for the lives it claimed, but for the lessons it offers about wildfire behavior and the dangers of building communities in fire-prone landscapes. Many of those lessons remain relevant today as climate change increases the risk and severity of wildfires across the American West and around the world. Today, if you walk through downtown Chicago, you're walking through the legacy of the Great Fire. The towers that scrape the sky, the grand museums along the lakefront, the famous loop with its elevated trains. All of it was built on the ashes of 1871. The architectural innovations pioneered in post-fire Chicago spread around the world, shaping the skylines of cities from New York to Shanghai, the spot where the O'Leary Barn once stood. 137 DeKoven Street is now the site of the Chicago Fire Academy, where the city trains its firefighters. It's a fitting tribute. The place where the fire began is now dedicated to preventing future disasters. The city's motto, I Will, which emerged from the determination to rebuild, eventually evolved into the current motto, Urbs in Horto, City in a Garden. But that spirit of determination, of refusing to be defeated by disaster, remains at the heart of Chicago's identity. The Great Chicago Fire was a tragedy that took lives, destroyed fortunes, and displaced a third of the city's population. But it was also a catalyst for transformation, a moment when catastrophe created the conditions for innovation. The fire didn't kill Chicago, it forced Chicago to become something greater. And that, perhaps, is the most important lesson of all. Disasters reveal character, both individual and collective. When the flames died down and the smoke cleared, the people of Chicago looked at the ruins of their city and made a choice. They could have given up, moved away, started over somewhere else. Instead, they picked up their tools and went to work. They rebuilt their homes. They rebuilt their businesses. They rebuilt their city, bigger, stronger, and more beautiful than before. The Great Chicago Fire lasted 36 hours. Chicago's spirit endured. Thanks for watching. If you found this video informative, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us create more content like this. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Did you know about the Peshtigo Fire? Have you ever visited Chicago? What other historical disasters would you like us to cover? For more deep dives into history's most fascinating stories, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for notifications. We release new videos every week. Until next time, take care. And remember, from the ashes of disaster, something new can always rise.